Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Well, as I'm watching the events going on in the General Assembly, of course, of the United Nations going on in New York City, over the last couple of days, and the next couple of days for that matter, too. I couldn't help but compare and contrast the presentations and the reaction from, well, two North American leaders, our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who is there and making presentations, and the menace from the White House, of course, Donald Trump, who addressed the General Assembly, also at the United Nations for the first time in about 7 years. We'll get to his presentation in just a second. First of all, though, to Prime Minister Carney. Now, this, of course, is the first time that Mark Carney has been at the United Nations and is in the General Assembly as a Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of this country, of course, but not the first time he's been involved with the United Nations, nor with many of the world leaders who are attending these events. As we've talked about in the past, in his past capacities, of course, as the Bank of Canada governor, the Bank of England governor, a number of committees that he sat on the G7 and G20 and United Nations, financial committees and environmental committees. And they are two linked entities, by the way, notwithstanding what Donald Trump may think. These guys know him. The people that are attending this thing know him. And as evidenced by the fact that it's pretty obvious that Mark Carney is a guy who's in demand at the General Assembly in the UN as they assemble again this week. They know him. They want to hear what he's got to say. They want to know what his ideas are. And maybe best evidenced by a presentation that he made to the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, of course, as part of the General Assembly get-together over the last couple of days. Carney did a small presentation there, but then did a Q&A with a number of the delegates, of course, and also with members of the media, all off the cuff. There were no notes, no talking points or anything like this, and put, I think, a very strong case, a well-thought-out case, a very clear analytical approach to the challenges in the world, how Canada is approaching those challenges, how Canada can contribute to the solutions to those, what he is proposing to do with the legislation that he's already passed in this country about maximizing our natural resources and moving our economy along, and, of course, increasing the work that's being done to try to maximize that with his big builders bill that's already moving along now. I found it interesting on first of all, how well received those ideas were. Second of all, how well many of the people in attendance from the Foreign Relations Committee actually knew about these things. They're looking for solutions. They're looking to Canada, and they're looking to people like Prime Minister Carney for those solutions. And the questions that they presented to him indicated quite clearly to me, and I'm sure to others, that they had an understanding of this and they wanted to get more details about how Canada's approaching this because they looked at it as a very valid and hopeful way to try to deal with some of these problems. And Carney, of course, had those answers. That's kind of gratifying. We don't always do that well on the international stage. And frankly, in past United Nations get-togethers, General Assemblies, Prime Ministers have been there, and Prime Ministers have attended, and Prime Ministers have made presentations. But aside from commenting on what was going on in the world, oftentimes we didn't have a whole lot to offer, to contribute. Carney does. And I think the delegates at the UN and the delegates certainly in the Foreign Relations Committee certainly understood that. And Carney, I thought, did very, very well in presenting Canada's case. And not only that, but the consistent message that he also made, I think, during his presentation to the General Assembly, a similar line about how Canada can be a player. We've talked about Carney's assertion that Canada can be and is an energy superpower. We just need to maximize not just our potential, but what's already here and make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to be able to do that. And that's a sign of hope. And I think that's what they were looking for at the United Nations and that kind of positive imaging that comes on right now. The theme of the General Assembly is basically better together. In other words, we can do these things, we can assess what needs to be done, and we can accept and meet the challenges that are in the world these days together, as opposed to doing it individually. It's a laudable goal, and something that we've talked about before, and something that the Prime Minister certainly talked about, especially from the Canadian perspective. He's talked about that here within our boundaries, provinces, federal government, even municipalities, all working together, rowing in the same direction. And that seems to be the mindset that the United Nations has adopted. So there was a clarity there in Carney's comments, and I think that was so well received. And it was kind of nice to see that Canada is in that elevated position right now as a player. That there's a lot to give here and a lot to offer. We didn't always present ourselves in that fashion in past General Assemblies of the United Nations. Carney, I think, has changed that for the better, and it's going to be interesting to see. And handled a lot of the tough questions too, as evidenced by the fact that the deal about recognizing Palestinian state, a very controversial issue in some people's minds, and there's a lot of pushback on that. But Carney explained, I think, the Canadian position quite well, both to the General Assembly and, of course, to the Council on Foreign Relations. Said it's necessary in our judgment and the judgment of most other countries in the world that we have to push for this now. And it's worth noting, by the way, that this whole idea of recognizing the Palestinian state is not a new idea. It's not something that Canada just cooked up, or the UK or France. And I know those are the nations that are being talked about. But the reality here is that 156 of the 193 member nations of the United Nations recognize the state of Palestine. That's 75% of the nations in the United Nations are already there. And Canada is joining that number. The United States, of course, is not, because of Netanyahu's position in Israel. And so it's always going to be a controversial issue. But this is not a new idea. It's something that was talked about back in 1948, the UN resolution to actually create a two-state solution, an Arab and a Jewish state. Brief overstate. I mean, it did not work out well. We know that. There's still work to be done for a whole lot of reasons, because there are people that have tried to undermine this process from the start. But what makes the UN resolution and Canada's joining of that resolution, I guess, even more problematic right now is, of course, Netanyahu in Israel is against the two-state solution, which is not a new Israeli position. I mean, there has been a two-state solution being proposed by the Israelis in the past. Netanyahu is not an advocate for that. So we don't know where that's going to go. But Prime Minister Carney and many other world leaders, as I say, 75% of the members of the UN feel that the time is now. And as Carney mentioned, this is not by any stretch of the imagination some panacea that say, well, it's all going to go away now. There's a lot of work to be done. They still want to have free and clear elections. They want Hamas out of there, and that's going to take an awful lot of work. And I don't think anybody's going into this with rose-colored glasses thinking it's going to be easy. But Canada is committed to working with those other nations, and that's interesting. Very briefly, let me go to the other world leader from North America who addressed the United Nations. Donald Trump, for the first time in about 7 years, delivered an in-person address at the United Nations. And the clown show was in New York. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. As a North American resident, as somebody who appreciates politics and the challenges and the world leaders are facing these days, I was embarrassed to watch Trump perform, as he often did. Going off script, he spoke for about 55 minutes. By the way, that's about 3 times his allotted time. The speakers, whoever it is, not just the President of the United States, but the other speakers, Macron and Carney and all the others, they all have time limits that you're supposed to adhere to. What I found interesting, though, is that when you're speaking to the General Assembly, if you're approaching your time limit, there's a little red light that not too many people can see that goes off to kind of tell you, hey, your time's up, wrap it up, buddy. That never went off, apparently, according to some sources. Trump spoke for 3 times as long, and nobody stopped him, and nobody just said, okay, enough is enough. Clearly, it was a typical Trump speech, ranting and raving, unhinged, meandering, with a litany of false statements and boasts about himself. The same sort of stuff that we in North America hear all the time from the guy, when he sits there at the Resolute table in the White House and just rambles on and on and on. And he got into that groove at the United Nations. I don't know how it was received. There wasn't a whole lot of applause, some chuckling from time to time. There was almost a gentle applause, I guess, at the end of the speech that lasted a few seconds, and then that was that. But the message from Trump, I guess, is one of the reasons for that. Basically, he went there not to praise the UN, but to bury it. That's really what it came down to. He basically said that your countries are all going to hell. That was the message from Donald Trump to the United Nations. Green energy policies and runaway migration is killing the world. And he went on to talk about climate change as a hoax and on and on and on. I mean, some of the stuff that he's talked about here were hallmarks of the speech today. Dismissed climate change as the greatest con job ever perpetrated by the world. And immigration and the high cost of so-called green renewable energy is destroying a large part of the free world. It went on and on and on. And of course, in typical Trump fashion, went on and did a number of off-ramp things. I mean, he complained for about 5 or 10 minutes about the fact that Donald Trump, the real estate guy in New York, didn't get the contract to do the renewal for the United Nations building. he bid for it, I guess, and they went someplace else. And he basically bitched about that for I don't know how many minutes. That I could have done this, I could have done that. You should have gone with Trump. It had nothing at all to do with what's going on. But I mean, I don't want to say I don't know how this guy's brain works, because I don't know if his brain does work. But it just seemed to be typical Donald Trump. And for the world leaders who don't hear this stuff on a regular basis, it was not reassuring to know that the leader of the strongest nation in the world right now really doesn't have his act together and just is kind of meandering from one topic to another with no real resolutions. He did his usual thing about bragging about trying to stop and has stopped 7 wars. That's not true. He says the United States now is the greatest nation on earth. I argue that inflation is down, that prices are down. They're not. That, employment is down. And on it goes. Just false claims about almost everything, which, again, is basically the same sort of rhetoric and the same sort of message that Trump has been giving for the longest time. And on the one hand, I guess it was interesting to see that, okay, now the world sees what Americans are putting up with these days. And it's interesting to see just how they're going to respond to this. Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he spoke earlier, said that one of the greatest challenges right now is that the principles of the UN are under assault like never before. Well, Trump came to the podium after him, and if he thought that they were under assault before, after Trump's speech, he must have figured, okay, that just shows my point. The United States is not a friend, although Trump says, yeah, we like the UN, we support the UN. Well, no, they don't. No, they don't. The reality is that the United States, under Donald Trump, has withdrawn all financial support for UN, for the programs. They're not paying their share. Just like Trump likes to whine and complain that countries like Canada and others aren't paying their fair share into NATO, the United States is basically pulled out of the United Nations. They may still be a member, and they're on the Security Council, but they're not pulling their weight. They're not contributing financially. Which is why things like the World Health Organization and so many other agencies that do great work around the world are hard-pressed right now to do that work, because the United States is not ponying up. That's the reality. Of course, he didn't want to talk about that. He talked about a number of initiatives with some of the global conflicts that are going on. The fact that he praised the fact that he's imposing super high tariffs on Brazil because he said of what they called some parliamentary and political inequities. Well, the reason for that is, of course, a court in Brazil has convicted Bolsonaro, one of Trump's old buddies, another guy who just, is moving for these totalitarian governments. He was found guilty of trying to rig the election and try to overthrow the election. He faces 27 years in jail. I find it interesting because Trump kind of was, accused of and insinuated to be guilty of the exact same thing with the January 6th stuff. Of course, he's on any jail time or anything for any of the things that he's actually been convicted of. But just the same, kindred spirits, I guess. He's just looking at this. So he's punishing Brazil because they're punishing wrongdoers. I only wish that the American system and the American judicial system would start punishing people that are the wrongdoers in that country, and he's right at the top of that list. But I digress. Anyway, it was interesting to see just how the presentations came about and how they were being received. These are critical times. As we talked about at the beginning of the podcast every day, these are critical discussions in critical times. And that's what's going on in New York this week at the United Nations. They don't have all the solutions. The United Nations is not as effective as it could be and should be. And I think most member nations understand that. But to have somebody like Trump simply go up there and rant and talk about how crazy things are and how things that the United Nations has been working on, like climate change, alternative energy sources, etc., he says they're part of the problem. And for years and years and years, the United Nations has said, no, they're part of the solution. And as long as they're working at odds like that, I don't know how successful things are going to be with the UN. The UN needs the United States. They need their money, but they also need their support in a number of these programs. And notwithstanding what Donald Trump says during his rants from that podium, that's simply not happening these days. And that does not spell success for the UN going into the future. As they've said at NATO, and as they've said at the G7, and soon to be at the G20 when they convene again, they're going to have to get along without the United States right now. It's going to be very difficult, but Donald Trump has made it very, very clear that the United States is not going to be a player and is not going to be part of the solution to some of the problems facing the world. And that is problematic, to say the least. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Thanks for watching us on YouTube. Don't forget, hit that notification bell to make sure you spread the word about this. And thank you to everybody for signing on for the subscribe button as well. There's a lot going on, and we like to create this conversation and keep the conversation and the dialogue going. And your contributions and your support help us to be able to do that. Thanks to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured. But you can choose the right lawyer. Wisden's Law, 905-522-1102 or wisdenslaw.com.